going to tell you a short story about the United States that kind of indicates, as I said, that this is not unique to contemporary developing countries, because it was the United States that actually invented this practice of patronage, or what political scientists call clientelism. So this is where a politician, in order to get political support, basically gives individual bribes to voters in terms of a job or a payoff, a Christmas turkey, get out of jail card, something like that. So in the United States, the earliest government after the ratification of the Constitution could be said to be run by the Friends of George Washington. They're all graduates of Harvard and Yale, very elite, in that planter, merchant planter, gentry aristocracy that actually ran the United States in those days. In 1828, you had a key election which brought Andrew Jackson to power. He ran against John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a Boston Brahmin. He was educated at Harvard. His father was the second president of the United States. He traveled in Europe. He could speak several European languages. Andrew Jackson was a frontiersman. He came from rural Tennessee. He didn't have much of a formal education. He was an Indian fighter, a brawler, big drinker. He won the Battle of New Orleans and so became a military hero. And that set up this polarity in American politics between this Northeastern elite and a populist, core of the country. And Jackson, because of the expansion of the franchise that was going on, won that election. I think a lot of times that the distinction between Jackson and John Quincy Adams was a little bit like the distinction between, let's say, John Kerry, the Boston Brahmin, and Sarah Palin. You get exactly the same resentment on the part of, this is a serious continuity, because there's a serious populist hostility to being run by graduates of, that the country should not be run by graduates of Harvard and Yale. People, should govern themselves. So Jackson wins the presidency, and he says two things. First, I won the election, so I should get to choose who works in the American government. And secondly, didn't put it in quite these terms, but he said any fool can be a bureaucrat, in the United States, and it doesn't take much of an education. And this was a period in which, the average level of education in the United States was not all that high. So this sets about a 100-year period known as the spoils system or the patronage system, in which virtually every single government official from top to bottom, from the federal government down to, here in New York in Tammany Hall, was there because they were paid off by a politician for their political support. And as a result, the tremendous corruption scandals. Abraham Lincoln, if you read his letters, just bemoans the fact that he's besieged by people seeking offices. In fact, he loses the first few battles in the Civil War because he's hired these political generals. There's some politician from Ohio that he owes a favor to, and they're completely incompetent. And the Union side loses a lot of soldiers because of this kind of incompetence. So this was really American government in the 19th century. So it's not different from contemporary Brazil, India, Turkey, so forth, Mexico. We tend to look down on these countries and say, what's wrong with you? Don't you understand that corruption is a bad thing, and so forth? But we invented this because I think that this kind of patronage should more properly be seen as an early form of democracy. If you're trying to mobilize people and get them to the polls in a country that's got a lot of poverty or low levels of education and income, this is the easiest way to do it. People don't care about big, policy issues. They care about a job for their, husband or brother or whatnot. So then the question, I think the important lesson for contemporary developing countries is how the United States got out of it, and the answer was politically. The problem was political, and the answer was political. Every congressman had an incentive to keep the system going. By the 1880s, you had new middle classes, you had civic groups, the beginnings of American civil society. A lot of people that didn't want this system. They thought it was corrupt. There was a big groundswell grassroots movement where grandmothers were really upset that their fourth-class postmaster was a political hack. And then with some good leadership, you got a big movement for civil service reform. But it took a big tragedy to actually bring this about, which was the assassination of James Garfield. He was elected in 1880, and he was shot by an office seeker, a would-be office seeker. He took 6 weeks to die, a very painful death. And as a result, Congress was embarrassed into passing something called the Pendleton Act in 1883, which established the first U.S. Civil Service Commission, created a modern merit-based civil service. And so this was the beginning of the progressive era when the United States finally acquired something that looked like a modern bureaucracy. So this was the story. This is how I think any developing country is going to have to deal with this kind of issue